In my previous video, I did my top 5 best drivers of 2022. Make sure to go check that out. I'll have a link to it in the description box down below. But in this video, I'm going to be doing my top 5 worst drivers of 2022. Now, as always, at the end of the video, don't forget to let me know your top 5 in the comments box down below, and also give me some reasons as well in terms of why you chose those drivers and also in those positions. I do want to say right off the bat that it's always a little bit more difficult to do these top 5 worst driver lists because in truth, I think only 2 or 3 drivers on this list had kind of bad seasons. The rest of these drivers, I think it's a little bit more difficult to kind of pad out that top 5 with drivers that I think deserve to be on that list. So, for example, someone like Zhou Guanyu, he did not make my list because I think in his rookie season up against a really difficult teammate in Valtteri Bottas, even though statistically he might have even been worse than some of these drivers, I think relative for his rookie season, the fact that he didn't even crash that much, I think he had a positive and smooth rookie season. So again, although the championship standings might not look great for a driver like that, he doesn't make my list because I don't think it's fair to say that Zhou, in my opinion, has been one of the top 5 worst drivers relative to his experience and expectations as well. So yeah, it's always a bit more difficult doing these lists, but nevertheless, let's get into the top 5. And first up, I have got Lance Stroll. Now, just like for my video for my top 5 best drivers, I will also have on the screen some stats about these drivers. Now, I am not going to kind of go through each of the stats and each of the numbers for each of the drivers. It's more so for you to kind of reference, and I will reference them periodically when I talk about something, but it's more so for you to kind of reference and compare with the other drivers. Now, for the most part, they're all pretty self-explanatory, but obviously we've got the points, we've got the amount of times that they finished without scoring a point, so the non-points finishes, we've got the DNFs, which again is pretty self-explanatory. We've also got the race head-to-heads. Now, just like for my top 5 best drivers, in terms of the race head-to-heads, this is only for when both of the drivers finish the race. So again, it's not a perfect metric, but it kind of takes away some of the reliability elements. And so yeah, this is only for when both the drivers finished the race. Next up, we have the quali head-to-head. And then lastly, we have the percentage of points. And what that means is the amount of points they scored as a percentage compared to the entire team. So yeah, let's get first of all into Lance Stroll. Now, I must be honest, again, Lance is not a bad driver. I don't think he had a shocking season, but the reason why he makes this list for me is that Lance is now a very experienced driver. So the whole, even though he is still a young driver, experience and age just goes completely out the window. He is he's a seasoned veteran, especially at that team where he's been there since 2019, obviously in various guises. And I really did think that what really kind of made me put Lance on this list is not necessarily that he did such a bad job up against Sebastian Vettel, because you can see their head-to-heads are, relatively close, and to be that close up against a 4-time world champion is not too bad. But the reason why Lance goes on there is because a driver of that experience, I know the car wasn't great at the beginning of the season, but the Aston Martin, in all seriousness, by the end of the season, that was a very good car. It was a very solid midfield car. There was even some races like in Austin where it was arguably best of the rest, even ahead of the Alpines and the McLarens. Now, it was a very up and down car, there's no doubt about it. Even in the second half of the season when the team kind of developed it, they brought a second spec, the first spec of the car was an absolute disaster, we know that, but they brought a brand new spec, Spec 2 car in Spain, and when they developed it and learned more about their car, by the second portion of the season, it was a very good car, if still a little bit inconsistent. So in Austin, it was arguably best of the rest, and then in Mexico, the team just couldn't get the tires to work, so it was a bit of an erratic car, but it was a car that could score some decent points. And ultimately, the reason why Lance makes this list is because I feel like if that team did have 2 solid drivers like a Vettel and a Perez, or a Perez and a Sainz, or even a Vettel and an Alonso, I think Aston Martin could have got the job done over Alfa Romeo in the Constructors' Championship. And ultimately, although I don't think Stroll's had a bad season and done a bad job, I think with the driver of his experience, I expected him to kick on a little bit more and maybe make the difference up against an Alfa Romeo who had a rookie in the in the other seat, and ultimately he didn't. And Austin is the one race where I go back because Lance Stroll does have, once in a full moon, Lance Stroll has these kind of amazing performances, and Austin was looking like a weekend where he could have finished best of the rest. and then the one crucial weekend. And when you're in the midfield, it sometimes is just that one race where you need everything to come together and stay calm as a driver. And obviously, up against Alonso, he jinked a little bit to the left, a little bit too late and a little bit too erratically, and ultimately took himself out of the race and seriously dropped a whole bunch of points that the team could have scored, which ultimately by the end of the season could have cost, that did cost them in the constructors. So yeah, I feel like Lance Stroll does have the pace, and he is a driver who I think deserves to be in Formula 1, but he's definitely not one of the drivers that I think other teams are actively hunting. So again, I've used this metric before on my channel. When you think about, does a driver deserve to be in Formula 1? If that driver was dropped by his team right now, how many teams do you think that he could go into where he would improve their driver lineup straight away? And with Lance Stroll, there just isn't that many teams. So I'm not saying he's a bad driver, but in terms of this season, I think he should have kicked on a little bit more. I think especially in the latter half of the season, he should have been just a little bit more consistent. And ultimately, again, even though I don't think he's had a bad season, I think he cost Aston Martin in the Constructors' Championship. Next up in 4th place, I have got Yuki Tsunoda. Now, the good thing about Yuki, what I want to say straight away, is that he definitely has developed over his rookie season. I think he was a little bit more consistent. He was a lot closer to Pierre Gasly, especially in qualifying. And he did, even though he did still have some kind of Yuki moments, like crashing out the pits in Canada, crashing into his teammate in Silverstone, which was very painful, he has cut out some of those big crashes that he had in 2021. So he's definitely developed as a driver. And I will also say that AlphaTauri has never been the smoothest team in terms of, on an operational level. Like, even the whole shenanigans in Zandvoort, sending him out and then, pit it and then kind of like stopping on the side of the track. It's just a team where, sometimes it's very difficult to have a clean weekend. But the reason why Yuki goes in 4th is that even though he has done a relatively solid job, I just think that there was a chance, even in his second season, I know he's still a young driver, obviously, I just felt there was a chance to be potentially even closer to Gasly, maybe even beat him. And I mean, again, when you look at the amount of, he's only scored points 4 times this season. I mean, 18 non-point finishes. Now, he has been unlucky at times, I think, with reliability, but I really did expect a little bit more from Yuki, because I feel like, especially up against Gasly, Pierre Gasly did not have a great season, in my opinion, especially in the second half of the season. I'm not saying Pierre Gasly kind of mailed it in, obviously, once he knew that he was going to, to Alpine, but there was a lot of frustration building in Pierre, and I feel like that could have been an opportunity for Yuki to kind of potentially score even more points and get even more closer to Gasly. But as much as he's improved, I still feel like there's more in that car. There was still some mistakes, obviously, in Singapore. He had another crash. And I feel next year, these first 2 years up against, you can use the Gasly excuse to say almost Gasly was a much better driver, much more experienced. So, you can give kind of respite for those 2 seasons. But next year is going to be a massive test for Yuki. And to be honest, if he doesn't perform, and I really do want him to perform, and some people know I am actually a big fan of Yuki Tsunoda. I really want him to do well. I am actively praying for him to have a good season next year, because up against another rookie in Nick de Vries, that is going to be basically win or bust for Yuki Tsunoda. He's got to perform in 2023, because there is a plethora of Red Bull juniors that, even if they didn't, like Liam Lawson is a great example, even though Lawson didn't make it into AlphaTauri this year, he is going to be hot for that seat next year. And when you look at someone like Nick de Vries as well, he's also hungry. Even though he's obviously going to be a young driver in Formula 1 terms, Nick has got a lot of racing experience, and that's going to be a big challenge for Yuki Tsunoda. And Yuki has got to come out on top. So when you look at his progression into 2022, he's definitely made steps, but I feel like I was just expecting a bit more, especially up against a kind of struggling teammate that hasn't had a great season, and ultimately, only scoring 34% of your team's points. That's just not good enough from Yuki. So yeah, I don't think it's been a great season by him. It's not been a shocking season, certainly nothing compared to his rookie season, but yeah, 2023 is going to be a massive test for him. And ultimately, if he doesn't do well enough, if he doesn't kind of start to lead the team just a little bit, and potentially not, if he loses out to Nick de Vries, he could be out for 2024, and I think that is a serious possibility. And next up, and in 3rd place, and the man that's definitely been a hot topic recently in Formula 1, Mick Schumacher. Now, I will actually also quickly plug a recent video that I did about Mick Schumacher and why it did not work out in Formula 1. I went into a lot more detail in that video, so yeah, definitely go and check that out. Again, I'll have it linked in the description box down below. In terms of why Mick is in 3rd and maybe, ahead of the other drivers as well, I think it's a combination of, I mean, as I talked in that video, it's a combination of a lot of factors. Obviously, the results aren't great. Again, 32% of the team's total points up against a driver that's, let's not forget, K-Mag is an experienced driver, but at the beginning of the season, he didn't even know that he was going to be driving for Haas, and that was an opportunity for Mick. Even if you take away 2021 and say that this was his rookie season, he still has invaluable experience from 2021 of being comfortable in Formula 1, knowing the tracks, and that is the sort of thing that real rookies like Zhou Guanyu didn't have coming into this season. So he did still have the experience of already being acclimatized to the sport. He had a much better car in 2022, and when he should have kicked on in that early part of the season when the car was still very, very good, he didn't, and it was the crashes that really done him over, especially early on. So, again, even compared to some of the other drivers on this list, yes, they've had scrapes, they've had a few incidents, but Mick was crashing chassis, and the amount of money that it cost the team, it already set him on the back foot early in the season. Now, he was able to really kind of kick on from there, actually, come back a little bit, and Haas also have a huge part to play in, why it didn't quite work out for Mick in Formula 1, or at least, for this season and for now. Because the thing is, Mick did get a lot better in the second half of the season. I feel like, especially when you look at the race head-to-heads, when both K-Mag and Mick finished the race, Mick actually, it was 9-5 to Mick in the race head-to-heads. And I feel like that speaks to... I think that speaks more to K-Mag, actually, because K-Mag is a blindingly quick driver. He can have magic moments, as we saw in Brazil, but Kevin Magnussen is also an erratic driver at times. He does get into incidents, and what that means is that those incidents are opportunities for Mick to potentially finish in front of him, which he did, but to also score points, which he wasn't quite able to. Now, again, Haas were a massive part of that. Their strategy was never good enough. There's a lot of things about the team and the kind of the dynamic that, again, I said in my Mick video, I think it was the wrong team with the wrong driver at the wrong time in his career, and ultimately I understand why they went with a more experienced driver for 2023, but that doesn't take away from the fact that there was opportunities for Mick to score points early in the season. There was opportunities to, to finish ahead of K-Mag, potentially in the championship, and whether it's the team's fault, whether it's Mick, whether it's, outside forces that didn't quite allow for the driver and team to kind of gel together and get the best out of each other, Mick is still a massive part of that. He is still the driving force. He is still the one that is in the car and leading the team. There is no better leader than the man that has to go out there and get the results. And ultimately, again, I come back to the fact that I think Mick deserved another chance in Formula 1 potentially, and I do think he deserves a chance, but there were opportunities for him to have a better season. There were opportunities for him to score points, and ultimately he didn't capitalize on those opportunities, and that's why he's not only third on my list, but also in the eyes of Haas, out of Formula 1. Here we are then into the top two, and in second place I have got Daniel Ricciardo. Just like with Yuki Tsunoda, this one hurts. Obviously, Daniel, I'm a big fan of Ricciardo, but I'm not a very big fan of when my drivers have terrible seasons, and yeah, Ricciardo had an absolute shocking 2022. Now, again, all of the context, this is not a Zhou Guanyu, this isn't even a Yuki Tsunoda, this is an experienced driver that has been there, done that, won Grand Prix, pole positions, been there when the spotlight is on him, and even won Grand Prix as recently as Monza last year. And for him to be as bad as he was in 2022, it really did hurt to watch, because I know how great Ricciardo can be, but ultimately, I mean, again, 23.3% of the team's total points, and that wasn't helped by the fact that, I'm not going to spoil where Lando Norris was in my top 5 best drivers, but he was very high up on that list. Lando did a great job, but that's irrespective of what Daniel Ricciardo was doing, because Daniel did not do a good enough job, full stop. And ultimately, I think it was... There's been a lot of talk, especially last year, about how the car dynamics of the 2021 McLaren didn't quite suit Daniel Ricciardo. Now, whilst I don't doubt that some of those characteristics maybe transferred, carried over into the 2022 car, and maybe it's baked into the McLaren design language, I actually don't... Lando also wasn't comfortable with this year's McLaren, but I think the problem for Ricciardo this year was especially that early momentum that, Lando had built. And I think mentally, it was less the car. I think mentally, Ricciardo has just been absolutely shot. And ultimately, and obviously I do some karting, I do a little bit of racing, and I kind of know sometimes how that feels. you can't make yourself drive faster when mentally you're struggling and you're having a bad day. There's no switch to just go, right, now I'm going to start performing well. Now I'm going to start, doing a good job, and now I'm going to, click with the car. And I feel like that's the problem that Ricciardo had. I feel like he's mentally burned out, and that's why he's almost kind of decided to write off 2023 and just take that year out. And I feel like that's been his biggest problem ultimately. When you put all of the factors together, the fact that the car wasn't as competitive as the team and Daniel wanted it to be, the fact that Lando has just had an outstanding season, which mentally is a massive pounding to the teammate. Ricciardo should have done better as an experienced driver, and mentally he wasn't able to stand up to that, which really, really hurt to watch, because again, we all know how good this guy was just 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, a driver of his experience should have done better. 23.3% of the team's total points is nowhere near good enough, and ultimately that's why I think he's, that's why he's second on my list. And a lot of that I think is to do with the fact that, again, that mental factor, and why he's taking a year out and looking to maybe return in 2023 if the hunger and motivation is still there. But yeah, it hurts to say it, but it's been a horrible way to see Daniel Ricciardo leave the sport, but hopefully it won't be the last that we see of him. And lastly, at number 1, I have got Nicholas Latifi. Maybe not a massive surprise, to be brutally honest. What can I say about Latifi that hasn't already been said, to be brutally honest? I'm not going to go in on the guy. To be brutally frank with you and to give it like some bullet points, he's not good enough for Formula 1. He was never really good enough for Formula 1. I don't think he gelled with the 2022 cars. I did see kind of some progress from his rookie season and to 2021. Like, he did make some progress and get a little bit closer to George, but something about the 2022 cars and the 2022 Williams, he's talked about the fact that he knows what the problem is, but he doesn't know how to solve it. He looks at what Alex Albon does, he looks at his data, and he just doesn't understand and doesn't have the talent to be able to do the same. Now, even though Alex is a good driver, Alex Albon is not like one of the best drivers on the grid, and ultimately, when you look at the quali gap, when you look at the fact that, and the stat just jumps off the page, in races where both Alex and Nicholas got to the end, Nicholas Latifi finished ahead of his teammate once, and I believe that was in Spain. Once all season. That is not good enough. That is nowhere near good enough. He obviously got slapped up in qualifying as well. And again, ultimately, he wasn't comfortable with the car. He doesn't have the talent and the speed to kind of adapt and kind of progress throughout the season and get more comfortable with the car and extract more out of his ability. And that's why he's not in Formula 1. When Williams dropped him, there was never going to be any takers in Formula 1, because although he is a nice guy, he doesn't have the speed, he doesn't have the mental capacity to kind of get on top of the car and get on top of the problems and progress with both the team and himself to get better and closer to Alex over the course of the season. And although, he did have obviously one good race and did score points in Japan in pretty tricky conditions, and we have seen that, to be fair, in the wet, obviously Spa 2021, Latifi actually qualified quite well. So, there is some ability there, but ultimately he wasn't good enough for Formula 1. He wasn't, and as I've said a million times, if you're not good enough to be in the team that is at the back of the grid, you're not good enough to be in Formula 1. And ultimately, when I look back at Latifi's time, obviously, the team rightly so decided to drop him, because, as I've always said, there was always, with Latifi at your team, there is a cap to what results you can get. You can have Max Verstappen or Lewis Hamilton in that Williams, but if you only have one driver that can really extract the maximum out of that car, that team is capped. And when your team is at the back of the grid, that's the last thing that you need. So yeah, it was no surprise that they decided to drop him and, try a young talent in Logan Sargent. But yeah, when I look back at Latifi's time in Formula 1, he wasn't an incompetent driver. He wasn't massively crash prone, really. He just wasn't quick enough, and ultimately I feel like the money and some results in Formula 2 got him into Formula 1, but I think not enough talent, not enough results, and perhaps more so the money is what kept him in the sport. Even in 2022, the fact that he's actually regressed and got even worse compared to where he was in 2021, that is why, unfortunately, he is my worst driver of 2022. Well, there you have it. That is this video wrapped up. Once again, don't forget to let me know your top 5 in the comments box down below. And if you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe as well. That would be massively appreciated. And I'll see you in the next one.